They said the child was born during a storm that split the valley sky open like a wound. The air that night smelled of copper and wet earth, and every dog in Millbrook wailed as if it felt something old and wrong being pulled into the world. The midwife, Ruth Penner, would later tell her sister that she had never seen blood that dark, almost black, pooling beneath the mother as if the earth itself was trying to take the baby back. When it was over, the rain stopped suddenly, and the house fell into a silence so complete that Ruth thought she had gone deaf. The mother, Dorothy Webb, didn't scream during labor. She just whispered one phrase over and over. "It's not supposed to look like that." When Ruth placed the infant in her arms, Dorothy turned her face toward the wall and refused to look. The baby's eyes were open, too open, as though they had been waiting. They were gray at first, then pale blue, then something else altogether, shifting under the lamplight like oil on water. The midwife wrapped the child in a blanket and stepped outside to wash her hands in the basin. But when she looked back through the cracked window, she saw James Webb standing over the crib. His shoulders were shaking, but his face was half in shadow. Ruth couldn't tell if he was crying or praying, or both. 3 hours later, she was gone. No one in town ever saw her again. Her sister claimed she packed up and left for Pittsburgh, but her name never appeared on a census, a paycheck, or a death notice. It was as if the valley swallowed her. That house still stands, leaning at the edge of Millbrook's northern ridge, its windows boarded, its foundation cracked by frost and time. Locals say you can still hear an infant crying inside on rainy nights, though the house has been empty for 70 years. Others say it isn't crying at all. It's laughing. If you're still here, tell me quietly, which city are you watching from, and what time is it where you are? Because in towns like Millbrook, time doesn't move forward. It circles back on itself, dragging the past behind it like a chain in the dirt. And every chain begins somewhere, with one cry, one lie. One child that didn't look like anyone in the family. Morning came slow to Millbrook, as if the sun itself hesitated to climb over the ridge. The Webb farmhouse stood in the gray light, damp and silent. James sat by the cradle, his hands clasped, eyes fixed on the child that would not stop watching him back. The baby didn't cry, didn't blink. Its chest rose and fell with the faintest breath. But its eyes, those eyes followed every movement he made. Pale and swirling, the color of river mist and bruised sky. James had worked the coal veins all his life. He'd seen accidents, burns, even death. But nothing frightened him like that silence. He whispered to himself that it was only a child, flesh of his flesh. But deep down, he knew something was wrong. 3 days later, the preacher came. Reverend Cole was a tall, stooped man with the kind of voice that made the air feel heavier. James had sent for him after Dorothy refused to leave her room, muttering scripture into the walls. She would not hold the baby, would not feed it, and when she slept, she woke screaming. Reverend Cole stood over the crib, his expression unreadable. He didn't touch the child, just looked. Then he said, "There's something old here." James swallowed hard. "Old?" The Reverend nodded slowly. "Older than you, older than me, older than this town." He leaned closer, whispering as though afraid to be overheard. "Sometimes a soul finds its way back through bloodlines. Sometimes it takes a body that doesn't belong to it." That night, the Reverend left before sunset, refusing supper. He told James to keep the child near the firelight, to never let the shadows touch it fully. Then he walked home down the dirt road, his Bible clutched tight. And the next morning, They found him at the edge of the river, face down in the mud, eyes wide open, as though he'd seen something before he went under. By the week's end, Dorothy had vanished too. Her shoes were left by the back door. Her nightgown was folded neatly on the bed. But her wedding ring was found in the baby's cradle. No one in Millbrook spoke of the Webbs after that. The sheriff sealed the house, the neighbors stopped visiting, and the story faded into whispers told by those who still remembered the night the storm came. But not everything that disappears is gone. Sometimes it waits, and the thing in that cradle, it was waiting too. By the time the boy could walk, Millbrook had already started to rot. Not in the way a body rots, with smell and silence, but in the way a place begins to forget itself. Roads cracked, wells soared, people left without saying why. The Webb boy was 5 when old Mr. Hasker found his livestock dead, necks twisted, eyes gone cloudy. He swore he saw a figure in the field that night, small and barefoot, standing in the rain. The next morning, the boy showed up at his fence line, barefoot and shivering, a faint smile on his lips. No one said anything. But from that day forward, mothers began to pull their children inside when the wind changed direction. James Webb tried to raise the child alone. He spoke little, drank more. The miners said he'd been keeping lamps burning all night, every night, as if afraid to let the dark touch his son. The boy would sit by the window for hours, watching the forest sway, never blinking, never speaking first. Sometimes James would wake to find him, standing at the foot of his bed, whispering words he couldn't understand. He dragged the boy back to his room, latched the door, pray under his breath. But every morning, the latch would be undone. By the time he was 7, the boy could read. No one had taught him. He began drawing symbols on the walls, spirals, circles with eyes inside, crosses bent the wrong way. The schoolteacher saw them once and refused to return to the house. That winter, snow came early. The mines closed. James vanished. Some said he went into the woods and never came back. Others whispered that he never left, that he was still in the house, somewhere behind the walls. When neighbors finally entered, months later, they found no trace of him. Only a faint humming coming from the upstairs room. The boy was sitting at the window again, watching the tree line. When they asked what he was doing, he smiled and said, "They're almost here." No one asked who they were. No one stayed long enough to find out. By spring, the Webb boy was gone too. The house stood empty again, the fields quiet, the town sinking deeper into its own silence. But when the wind came down the ridge, carrying the smell of rain and rust, people swore they could hear children's laughter echoing through the holler. Laughter that didn't sound quite human. Would you like me to continue with part 4? Where the curse resurfaces decades later, when someone new moves into the old Webb house, not knowing what sleeps beneath it. It was 1962 when the house drew breath again. A family from Ohio, the Harpers, moved into the old Webb place, thinking the valley's silence would be good for them. The father, Raymond, was a war veteran who wanted peace. His wife, Evelyn, said the hills reminded her of the countryside she grew up in. They brought one child, a daughter named Clara, pale and quiet, with eyes that caught the light in strange ways. The locals watched from a distance as the Harpers painted the shutters, trimmed the grass, hung lace curtains where boards once were. For a time, it looked like Millbrook might forgive itself. But forgiveness has never been part of the valley's nature. The first sign came in small ways. Milk curdled overnight. The clock in the kitchen stopped at 3:11 every morning, and the old well behind the house began to bubble as if something beneath it was breathing. Raymond laughed it off, said it was just bad plumbing, bad wiring. He didn't believe in stories. But Evelyn did. She began hearing whispers at night. Not words, just a rhythm, like someone humming an old hymn through the walls. She found small footprints in the ash near the fireplace, though Clara's feet were much larger. Once, she woke to find her daughter standing by the window, staring out at the ridge, her lips moving soundlessly. When she asked what she was saying, Clara turned and whispered, "They're still waiting for him." Evelyn didn't sleep after that. She began keeping a cross under her pillow, a candle burning through the night. The light helped at first, until the night it didn't, because one evening, around 3 a.m., the candle blew out on its own, and the house exhaled. The boards creaked, the windows flexed. Evelyn swore she heard footsteps moving across the ceiling, slow, dragging, child-sized. When she ran to Clara's room, the girl was gone. They found her outside, standing at the well, barefoot in the frost, her nightgown soaked. She was humming the same melody Evelyn had heard through the walls. When Raymond pulled her away, she screamed, not a child's scream, but something deeper, older, like the howl of a buried thing that had been disturbed. The next morning, they boarded the well. By nightfall, they packed to leave, but the car wouldn't start. The phone lines were dead, and when the sun set, the sound came again, the laughter, distant and low, rolling down the ridge like thunder. Raymond swore he saw figures in the field, small and grey, moving closer in the fog. He went out with his rifle and never came back. By dawn, Evelyn and Clara were gone too. Only one thing remained, a single handprint on the window glass, small, wet, pressed from the inside, and the hum never stopped. Would you like me to continue with part 5, where Millbrook's surviving townsfolk start to uncover the buried records of the Webb bloodline, and what that child really was? By the time the sheriff broke into the Harper house, the smell had already settled. It wasn't decay exactly, more like iron, wet soil, and something old that shouldn't have been disturbed. He said the house was colder inside than the frost outside. Every mirror was cracked, every clock frozen at 3:11. On the walls, someone, or something, had written a name in charcoal. Again and again. Webb. After that night, the sheriff sealed the house for the second time in 50 years. But word of what he'd seen spread through the valley like a sickness. Old families began whispering again, the kind of whisper that had teeth. They said the Webbs had been here long before Millbrook had a name, before the railroad, before the coal camps, before the church itself. That the first Webb wasn't a man at all, but something that came up from the mines one spring, carrying a light that wasn't a lamp. The miners followed him out, eyes burned white, muttering that the ground had a voice. No one wrote that in the county records, but you could still find fragments. A baptism ledger with names crossed out, birth certificates missing fathers, a coroner's report signed in trembling ink, no natural explanation. By 1970, only a handful of people remained in Millbrook. Most had moved away, claiming the valley made them forget things. The ones who stayed never lived past 40. But one man didn't leave. Elias Trent, the town historian. He spent years digging through archives, tracing the Webb line backward through courthouse fires and missing church books. What he found made no sense. Every few generations, a child appeared whose blood couldn't be traced. Records called them wards, orphans, unnamed kin, but the birthplaces all led back to one spot, the ridge above the old Webb house. In 1974, Elias wrote a letter to the state archives. It was never sent. They found it years later in his desk drawer, unfinished. It read, "The Webb child was not born. He was returned." The storm was not weather. It was an opening. The blood here is not human as we understand it. It remembers. A week later, Elias hanged himself in the courthouse attic. The rope had snapped twice before it held. When they buried him, the ground wouldn't take the coffin. The soil was too hard, like frozen metal. And that night, a child's voice echoed through the town again, humming the same broken tune the Harpers had heard decades before. The sheriff said it came from the ridge. The others swore it came from beneath their feet. But one thing was certain, Millbrook was awake again. In the spring of 1981, Millbrook appeared on a map again. A small team from the University of Kentucky, 3 anthropologists, 1 photographer, and a linguist, arrived in the valley to document Appalachian oral histories and local superstitions. They'd read fragments of Elias Trent's papers, buried deep in the county archives. His letter had become a curiosity among academics, dismissed as the breakdown of a man gone mad in isolation. But curiosity has its own gravity, and Millbrook was waiting. The team rented rooms in the old boarding house across from the defunct post office. By then, only 12 residents remained in town. Quiet, pale people who didn't smile. They spoke little, and when they did, it was only to warn, don't go near the ridge after sundown. Don't drink the well water. Don't call the name you find carved in the walls. Dr. Anna Lewis, the team's leader, recorded those warnings in her field notes. Amused by their solemnity, she wrote, "The townspeople treat the Webbs like a ghost still paying rent." On the 3rd day, they found the house. The old Webb place stood half, swallowed by vines, its porch sinking, its roof sagging inward like a skull caved from within. Inside, the air was thick and sweet, like rotting apples. Dust hung in slow motion. The walls still bore faint marks, spirals, eyes. A single word scratched into the wood beneath the staircase returned. The photographer, Dale, set up his flash. But every time he took a picture, the film came back white, washed out, as if the house refused to be seen. When they developed one roll, a shape appeared in the corner of a frame, small, pale, standing just behind Dr. Lewis. That night, the team stayed in town. The linguist, Miriam, said she couldn't sleep. She'd heard whispering through the boarding house pipes. She swore it wasn't English, but something that sounded like the rhythm of scripture reversed. By dawn, she was gone. Her bed was empty, her recorder still running. On the tape, there were footsteps, then a child's hum, low and steady, circling the microphone until the tape ended in static. The next morning, they followed her tracks to the ridge. They stopped at the well. The boards that sealed it were splintered outward, as though something had climbed up from beneath. Dr. Lewis dropped a flashlight down. It fell for 7 seconds before hitting something that sounded wet. Later that day, the remaining team members packed to leave. But the road was gone. The asphalt ended abruptly at the forest's edge, the rest of it swallowed by mud and trees that hadn't been there the day before. In her final journal entry, Dr. Lewis wrote, "The valley is shifting. The house is not a place, it's a mouth." None of them were ever seen again. Only the camera was found, washed up in the river weeks later, its final frame showing a hand pressed to glass, small and wet, reaching from the inside out. The following winter, the federal government arrived, quietly. No press, no notices. Just 3 black sedans and a pair of unmarked trucks that rolled into Millbrook before dawn. The last 12 residents were temporarily relocated to neighboring towns. Within 48 hours, Every road into the valley was fenced off. Signs went up reading "Componented Cite NTRA PROIT." But it wasn't contamination they feared. Inside the perimeter, men in hazmat suits and dull green uniforms began digging. Not for coal or oil. Those veins were long dead. But for something they wouldn't name. The operation was classified under an environmental survey program that didn't exist before that year. Its code name, Project Pile. Later records, heavily redacted, mention anomalous biological readings beneath substructure of residents and auditory exposure incidents resulting in psychogenic trauma. Of the 23 personnel assigned, 8 went missing within the first month. The others reported hearing children's voices echoing through their radio headsets at night, singing an unfamiliar lullaby. The frequencies weren't recorded, only described. Not human. Not electronic, like something breathing through the static. Then came the survivor. His name was Agent Thomas Hale. A communications officer. He vanished during week 6 and reappeared 3 days later at the highway checkpoint, barefoot. Eyes sunburned from staring into something bright. He kept repeating a single phrase over and over. It opened. The ground opened, and it had eyes. Medical notes say his pulse never slowed below 130 p.m., even sedated. Before he was transferred to a military hospital, he scratched something into his own forearm with a pen cap. A spiral surrounding a single word web. The government sealed Millbrook permanently after that. The mining entrances were collapsed, the houses burned. Only the church steeple survived, rising crooked from the ash. But fire doesn't erase memory. In the years that followed, locals from the next county began reporting strange tremors under the ridge. Small, rhythmic, like the beating of a buried heart. One farmer claimed his cattle refused to cross the old boundary line. Another swore he saw footprints appearing in the frost, walking backward into the woods. Declassified files released decades later mention one final recording, recovered from Hale's destroyed radio unit. 17 seconds long. The first 12 seconds are static. Then comes a faint child's voice, whispering, not in English, not in any language known. But those who've listened closely say it sounds like the name of someone being called home. And in the final second, the voice becomes 2, then 3, then many, all laughing. Would you like me to continue with part 8? Where a modern journalist uncovers these sealed documents and decides to go to Millbrook herself, unknowing that the valley has already begun calling her name. The valley had been silent for 40 years when the journalist arrived. Her name was Alina Ward, a documentary reporter known for chasing the stories no one else would touch. The forgotten disappearances, the missing towns, the records that smelled of smoke and government ink. When she first read the declassified fragments of Project Pile, a GIA, she thought it was folklore dressed in bureaucracy. But there was something in those redacted lines, something alive, a pulse between the words. Alina drove into what was left of Millbrook in the fall of 2023. Her camera recorded everything: the rusted fence, the bent COTMIMNATC sign, the silence thick enough to press against her skin. The forest had swallowed the valley whole. Trees grew through old porches. The air tasted like copper and rain. She walked the ridge where the Webb house had stood. Only the stone foundation remained, blackened, half sunk into the earth. The well was still there too, sealed by slabs of concrete split down the center, as though something had pushed from beneath. Her recordings that first night were calms, the sound of cicadas, wind, and the faint trickle of water. But near midnight her microphone caught something else. A hum, low, circular, like a child singing under their breath. She followed the sound toward the foundation, her flashlight trembling in her hand. Every few feet, she found small wet footprints in the soil, leading toward the well. At the rim, she crouched and whispered into the darkness, "Is anyone down there?" The hum stopped, then a whisper, a voice too close, as though it was breathing against her recorder's mic. A single word, "Returned." The footage ends abruptly there. Her camera was found 2 weeks later by hikers near the river, 17 miles downstream. The authorities labeled it an accident, an unauthorized trespass into a hazardous area. But her last video file, timestamped at 3:11 a.m., didn't match any logical sequence. It showed the valley from above, as though filmed from a height, even though her drone had never launched. In the frame, the land wasn't still, it was moving. The fields shifted in waves, and the old church steeple leaned toward the ridge, bending like a spine. And in the center, faint and luminous, was the outline of a house rebuilding itself, beam by beam, wall by wall, breathing. At the end of the clip, a figure appeared at the window, small, watching, and then Elena's own reflection flickered across the glass. Though she was never close enough to be there, the file corrupted after that. But when forensic analysts enhanced the final 2 frames, they noticed something impossible. Behind Elena's reflection, another face, pale, childlike, and smiling. They matched it to a photograph taken in 1912 of the Webb boy. Winter came early that year. The valley froze before the first snowfall. Crows circled above Millbrook, though no carrion lay beneath. And then, one night, the ridge began to glow. Satellite images captured what appeared to be a single light pulsing from beneath the earth. Steady, rhythmic, like a heartbeat. The coordinates matched the exact foundation of the old Webb house. The footage was flagged by state geologists, then quietly classified by Homeland Security. 2 days later, the light went out. But something had changed. Across 3 counties, people began to dream the same dream. They described a house made of breathing wood, its walls moving like lungs. A child sat by the window, humming through the dark, and outside, a figure watching, waiting to be invited in. The dreams always ended the same way. The child turning toward them, eyes gray and shifting, whispering, "You're from here too." When Elena's footage surfaced on the dark web months later, it was already too late to contain it. Those who watched it reported hearing faint whispers days after closing the file, echoes through their walls, wet footprints near their beds. One viewer in Virginia claimed her newborn spoke a word at 6 days old, returned. Researchers tried to trace the Webb bloodline to see where it ended. It didn't. The family name had dissolved in 1914, but the blood hadn't. It had branched, changed names, changed faces, moved outward like roots, threading through the country, through marriages, through generations. Every 7th generation, a child is born with gray eyes that shift in the light. Every 7th generation, the storm comes back to Millbrook, and this year, 2025, marks the 7th. The ridge is quiet again now. The road to Millbrook doesn't appear on GPS anymore. The trees have reclaimed what was theirs. But if you drive far enough into the Appalachian dark, past the signs, past the fences, you might hear it. A hum beneath the soil, soft and patient. It isn't the wind. It isn't the river. It's the house. Rebuilding itself, board by board, heartbeat by heartbeat. And somewhere, beneath all that earth, something ancient and unfinished is remembering the sound of your blood. Because you've heard this story before. Because maybe your grandmother was born near a ridge. Because maybe there's a name in your family Bible that no one says out loud anymore. Maybe you are what came back. And if you ever find yourself waking at 3:11 a.m., hearing a hum in the walls, don't answer it. Don't whisper back. Because once you do, the valley will know your name. And it will never let you go.